The German officers laughed first. That laughter, casual, confident, almost bored, echoed through briefing room and mess halls as if the war itself had already chosen its winner. It was the sound of men who believed history had taught them everything worth knowing. Across polished tables, beneath portraits of Prussian generals and maps, stained with cigarette smoke, America existed only as an abstraction, a distant and clumsy giant whose size mattered less than its supposed softness. In their minds, the United States was rich but unserious, loud but shallow, powerful only in theory. They had faced empires older than America and crushed them in weeks. Why should this new enemy be any different? In Berlin, reports from military attachés described an American army that barely resembled a professional force. Too few divisions, too many civilians in uniform, officers with no combat pedigree, training manuals filled with theories rather than blood-earned lessons. German intelligence officers, many veterans of Poland and France, underlined the same phrases again and again: inexperienced, undisciplined, dependent on machines. The Americans, they said, were soldiers of comfort. Take away their supply lines, increase the pressure, and they would collapse. Hitler absorbed these reports eagerly. His worldview demanded enemies that fit neatly into his ideological framework. Britain was decadent but stubborn. The Soviet Union was vast but racially inferior. America, in his eyes, was a mongrel nation driven by money rather than honor. Incapable of sustaining the moral weight of a real war, he believed democracies lacked the spine for prolonged sacrifice. Their people would protest, demand peace, and retreat back into isolation once the cost became visible. America's strength, he thought, was an illusion inflated by distance and wealth. Even among seasoned German generals, this belief found fertile ground. They compared the American army of 1941 to their own forces forged through years of rearmament and combat. German soldiers had marched through Europe under fire, crossed rivers, smashed defenses, and encircled entire armies. They'd learned war not from textbooks, but from the mud of battlefields. The Americans, by contrast, had parades, not scars. Their last major conflict had been a generation ago, and even then they had arrived late. To German eyes, history itself argued against America. When Pearl Harbor brought the United States fully into the war, the reaction in many German circles was irritation rather than alarm. The focus remained on Moscow and Stalingrad, on the Atlantic War against Britain. America was viewed as an industrial helper, not a decisive combatant. U-boats would strangle its supply routes. Japan would keep it distracted in the Pacific. Europe, the Germans believed, would be settled before American power could truly arrive. Then came the first encounters. In North Africa, American troops met German forces under harsh conditions they were unprepared for. The desert punished mistakes mercilessly. Units struggled with coordination. Orders became confused. Tanks advanced without infantry support. At Kasserine Pass, German armor exploited every weakness with ruthless efficiency. American lines broke. Soldiers retreated in disorder. Equipment was abandoned. German commanders watched it unfold with grim satisfaction. Here at last was proof. Reports sent back to Berlin were tinged with arrogance. The Americans, they said, lacked battlefield instinct. Their officers hesitated under pressure. Their troops panicked when confronted with experienced German units. This was not the army of a future world power. This was a nation pretending to fight a European war it did not understand. Yet even in these early moments, the German gaze remained dangerously narrow. They judged what they saw in front of them, not what stood behind it. They saw the men, but not the system producing them. They saw mistakes, but not the speed at which lessons were absorbed. They saw defeat, but not the reaction to it. Back in the United States, Kasserine was not explained away. It was dissected. Commanders were replaced. Training was restructured. Doctrine was rewritten with brutal honesty. The Americans did not cling to wounded pride or outdated methods. They adapted. What Germans perceived as weakness was In truth, flexibility. What they dismissed as inexperience was actually the beginning of a learning curve that rose at terrifying speed. While German officers mocked American soldiers, something else was happening far from the front lines. Cities across America transformed into engines of war. Automobile plants shifted overnight to tank production. Shipyards launched vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. Aircraft factories worked around the clock, producing fighters and bombers in numbers that defied European imagination. Women replaced men on assembly lines. Farmers grew food not just for themselves, but for armies across oceans. German planners had expected American industry to matter, but not to this extent. They thought in terms of European limits, factories vulnerable to bombing, labor constrained by geography, production slowed by scarcity. America operated on a different scale. Its resources seemed endless. Its distances protected its heartland. Its population accepted rationing and long hours, not with resignation, but with a sense of purpose sharpened by outrage. Still, German leaders clung to their assumptions. Industrial output, they argued, meant little without the will to endure losses. Americans, they insisted, would recoil once casualty lists grew. They believed the American public, insulated by oceans and comfort, would not tolerate the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. They underestimated how deeply Pearl Harbor had cut. They misunderstood how quickly a peaceful society could harden when struck without warning. To Germans, war was an extension of state power. To Americans, it had become personal. As American troops returned to North Africa, they did not resemble the force defeated months earlier. Command structures tightened. Combined arms tactics improved. Artillery coordination became devastatingly effective. Soldiers gained confidence through repetition and survival. German units began encountering Americans who no longer froze under fire, who maneuvered aggressively, who called in overwhelming support with ruthless efficiency. But the German High Command still viewed these changes as surface level. They believed experience could be gained, but character could not. And in their racialized worldview, American character was fundamentally flawed. They ignored warning signs because acknowledging them would mean questioning their entire understanding of the enemy. German intelligence continued to focus on order of battle numbers, on divisions and equipment. What they failed to measure was momentum. America was not just adding strength, it was accelerating. Every battle fought was another lesson learned. Every loss was converted into doctrine. Every mistake became institutional memory. German soldiers on the ground began noticing things their superiors dismissed. They noticed that American units attacked with confidence, supported by precise artillery and air power. They noticed that American logistics seemed inexhaustible. Fuel, ammunition, food, everything arrived on time, in quantity, even under fire. Where German units conserved shells, Americans saturated targets. Where German commanders calculated risk carefully, Americans often overwhelmed it. These observations filtered upward slowly, often softened by layers of bureaucracy and denial. No one wanted to be the officer who contradicted the comforting narrative. No one wanted to be the first to say that America might not just be participating in the war, but reshaping it. Germany's greatest error was not tactical. It was psychological. They assumed that nations fought wars the way Germany did, with rigid planning, centralized control, and limited margins for error. America fought differently. It allowed mistakes, absorbed them, and kept moving forward. It treated war as a problem to be solved rather than a destiny to be fulfilled. By the time German leaders began to sense the scale of their misjudgment, the foundations had already shifted beneath their feet. The enemy they had dismissed was no longer forming. It had formed, it was moving, and it was learning faster than anyone had believed possible. The laughter from those early days faded, replaced by uneasy silence, but silence, like laughter, could not stop what was coming. By 1943, the tone of German conversations about America had changed, though few admitted it openly. Confidence gave way to irritation, irritation to concern, and concern to something far more dangerous, disbelief. The war was no longer behaving the way German planners had promised it would. America had not collapsed under pressure. It had not fractured politically. It had not begged for compromise. Instead, it had arrived fully, loudly, and everywhere at once. German fighter pilots were among the first to sense the shift. In the skies over Western Europe, they had once hunted British bombers with calculated confidence. Losses were expected manageable. But when American daylight bombing intensified, the rhythm of air war changed. The bombers came in tight formations, box after box, bristling with defensive guns. Early on, German pilots scoffed at their rigidity, calling them predictable and naive. Then they flew through walls of fire and watched comrades vanish in midair. What unsettled them most was not just the bombers, but their persistence. Even after suffering horrific casualties, the formations returned the next day and the day after that. The Germans shot down dozens, sometimes hundreds, yet the sky never seemed emptier. Replacement crews arrived, as if summoned by an invisible machine. Aircraft losses that would have crippled the Luftwaffe barely slowed the Americans. German intelligence struggled to explain it. They knew America produced a lot, but the numbers coming from the front seemed unreal. Pilots reported seeing aircraft with unfamiliar markings, new models improved, designs appearing faster than German engineers could analyze them. Each month, the Americans seemed better prepared, more coordinated and more dangerous. On the ground, German commanders in Italy began reporting similar experiences. American units, once dismissed as clumsy, now operated with growing confidence. Their infantry advanced behind crushing artillery barrages. Their engineers rebuilt bridges with astonishing speed. Their supply columns moved relentlessly, often under fire, ensuring that frontline units never lacked ammunition or fuel. German defenders found themselves outgunned and outpaced. What disturbed German officers most was the Americans' willingness to accept losses without losing cohesion. In earlier assumptions, casualty sensitivity was supposed to be America's breaking point. Instead, American formations absorbed punishment and pressed forward anyway, where German doctrine emphasized careful conservation of experienced troops. American commanders often relied on replacement systems that kept units fighting even after severe attrition. This approach baffled German traditionalists. To them, experience was irreplaceable. Veterans were priceless. America seemed to treat manpower as renewable. This was not because American soldiers were expendable, but because the system behind them was vast, beyond European comprehension. Training centers continuously produced new units. Transportation networks moved men and material across oceans with clockwork precision. Losses were painful, but they did not paralyze operations. Meanwhile, the strategic bombing campaign intensified. German cities burned. Factories were hit again and again. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin by the Eastern Front, struggled to respond. Pilots were exhausted. Fuel was scarce. Replacement aircraft arrived slowly. American bombers, escorted by long-range fighters, pushed deeper into German airspace, targeting not just production facilities but morale itself. The arrival of American escort fighters marked another psychological turning point. Before, German pilots could strike bombers once they passed beyond British fighter range. Now, American fighters stayed with the bombers, aggressive and persistent. They did not merely defend, they hunted. Luftwaffe pilots who once dictated engagements found themselves pursued relentlessly. Air superiority, once a German hallmark, began slipping away. German ground troops noticed the same pattern during engagements with American forces in France after the Normandy landings. They expected chaos on the beaches, a repeat of earlier American mistakes. Instead, despite confusion and heavy casualties, the Americans established footholds. The logistics followed immediately. Artificial harbors appeared where none should have been possible. Supplies flowed ashore in staggering quantities. Within weeks, the beachheads transformed into launching points for an unstoppable advance. German soldiers fighting in Normandy described American artillery as overwhelming. It was not merely accurate, it was abundant. Where German units rationed shells, Americans fired freely. Requests for fire support were answered within minutes. Air power power hovered constantly overhead, striking roads, railways, and troop concentration. Movement during daylight became hazardous, sometimes suicidal. The Americans' coordination between air and ground forces astonished German officers. This level of integration required communication systems, training, and doctrine that Germany had not believed America capable of developing so quickly. Every battle revealed new refinements. Every engagement showed lessons learned from the last. Behind the lines, German commanders faced an equally dangerous enemy, time. America's strength grew daily, while Germany's diminished. Fuel shortages worsened. Replacement troops arrived undertrained. Equipment quality declined as factories were bombed and materials ran short. The imbalance became impossible to ignore. Yet even as evidence mounted, denial persisted at higher levels. Hitler dismissed negative reports, accusing officers of defeatism. He clung to the belief that technological miracles or sudden political collapse would reverse Germany's fortunes. Some generals, fearful for their positions, softened their assessments. Others tried to explain the reality, only to be ignored or reassigned. The Americans, meanwhile, showed no signs of exhaustion. Their society, far from fracturing, mobilized further. War bonds sold out. Production targets were exceeded. Training programs expanded. Losses were mourned, but not used as excuses for retreat. The war effort became embedded in everyday life, turning an entire nation into an extension of the battlefield. German officers who had once dismissed American soldiers as soft now described them as relentless, not fanatical like some German units, not driven by ideology but powered by an industrial and organizational momentum that felt unstoppable. Americans fought with confidence born of overwhelming support. They trusted their systems, their equipment, and their ability to recover from mistakes. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army ground Germany down with numbers and brutality. In the West, America and its allies applied pressure with precision and scale. Germany found itself squeezed between two forces it had underestimated for different reasons. Against the Soviets, racial arrogance had blinded German planners. Against the Americans, cultural arrogance had done the same. By late 1944, German defensive operations in the West were shaped by scarcity. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks. Ammunition rationing limited artillery fire. Air support was sporadic at best. American forces, by contrast, advanced with growing confidence, supported by endless convoys and air cover that dominated the skies. The final German offensive in the Ardennes revealed the full extent of the miscalculation. The plan depended on surprise, speed, and American collapse under pressure. Early gains fueled hope, but the assumptions behind the attack unraveled quickly. American units held critical positions despite encirclement. Supply lines adapted. Air power returned as weather cleared. The offensive stalled, then collapsed, draining Germany's last reserves. For many German officers, this was the moment clarity replaced illusion. America had not been a temporary participant or a secondary power. It had become the central force shaping the Western war. The nation they once mocked for its inexperience had mastered modern warfare with terrifying efficiency. By the time this realization settled in, it was irreversible. The misjudgment had already cost Germany its skies, its cities, and its ability to dictate the course of events. What began as laughter had transformed into a grim understanding. They were not fighting an amateur any longer. They were fighting a system that learned faster than it lost, and that difference changed everything. In the final months of the war, Germany no longer spoke loudly about America. The arrogance that once filled briefing rooms had evaporated, replaced by exhaustion, bitterness, and a quiet reckoning that crept into diaries, letters, and half-whispered conversations. The cities lay in ruins. Rail yards were twisted wreckage. Fuel was rationed to the point of paralysis, and everywhere, from the shattered streets to the muddy forests, German soldiers were encountering the full weight of a force they had once dismissed as incapable of real war. For many officers, the realization arrived not in a single dramatic moment, but as a slow, crushing awareness. It came when American columns advanced faster than German intelligence predicted. It came when defensive lines collapsed not because of cowardice, but because there was simply nothing left to stop them. It came when reports showed that units destroyed in the morning were replaced by fresh American formations by nightfall. The war had become something Germany could no longer control or even fully comprehend. Captured German officers began speaking candidly during interrogation. Many admitted they had underestimated the Americans from the beginning. They had believed America's diversity would make coordination impossible. Instead, it had created adaptability. They had assumed democracy would slow decision-making. Instead, it allowed rapid correction when mistakes were made. They had believed Americans lacked discipline. Instead, they found soldiers who trusted their system so completely that they could fight with calm confidence even in chaos. German soldiers on the front lines noticed something deeply unsettling about American troops. They did not fight with the desperation of men defending their homeland, nor with the ideological fury German propaganda glorified. They fought with professionalism and momentum. They advanced because that was what the system behind them demanded, and because that system rarely failed them. Food arrived. Ammunition arrived, medical evacuation arrived, reinforcements arrived. Wounded Americans were carried away and replaced with new men who already knew what to do. In contrast, German units increasingly fought in isolation. Communications failed, supplies dwindled, orders arrived too late or not at all. Veterans fought alongside boys and old men. The belief that experience alone could compensate for material collapse proved fatally wrong. Courage without support became a slow path to annihilation. German planners reflected bitterly on how wrong their assumptions had been. They had believed America would take years to prepare for large-scale war. Instead, America had prepared while fighting. They had believed American industry would take time to convert. Instead, it converted with astonishing speed. They had believed training competent soldiers required long tradition. Instead, America built competence through repetition, scale, and relentless improvement. Perhaps the greatest shock was cultural. German ideology had taught that only certain nations possessed the spirit for greatness. America did not fit that image. It lacked ancient myths, rigid hierarchies, and a unified ethnic identity. And yet, that very absence of rigidity became its strength. American soldiers questioned orders when they made no sense. Commanders replaced failed leaders without hesitation. Systems were redesigned instead of defended out of pride. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany, the contrast became impossible to ignore. German civilians watched endless columns of vehicles roll past, engine humming, uniforms clean, equipment standardized and plentiful. They saw soldiers who looked tired but not desperate, confident but not cruel. For a nation taught that America was decadent and weak, the reality was deeply unsettling. Some German officers privately admitted that the war had been lost. Long before the first American soldiers set foot on European soil, it had been lost. The moment Germany decided to judge America by its stereotypes instead of its potential. By the time Germany understood what it was truly facing, the machinery was already in motion, impossible to stop. Even as the Reich collapsed, Hitler clung to his illusions. He blamed generals, weather, fate, betrayal, anything except the original miscalculation. But the truth was unavoidable. Germany had prepared to fight old empires, slow-moving rivals bound by tradition and caution. It had not prepared to fight a nation that treated war as a problem of organization, production, and learning at scale. In prisoner of war camps after the surrender, German officers spoke with surprising clarity. Many expressed admiration mixed with regret. They described America as a force that grew stronger the longer the war lasted, a trait Germany had never accounted for. They spoke of a country that could lose battles without losing confidence, that could suffer casualties without losing direction. The end came not with a single catastrophic defeat, but with exhaustion. Germany simply ran out of options. American forces stood at the heart of the defeated Reich, not as the naive amateurs once mocked, but as the architects of a new world order. Their flags flew over bases, airfields, and cities that would soon be rebuilt with American aid rather than ruled by American fear. History would later record Germany's downfall in terms of strategy, resources, and alliances. But beneath all of that lay a simpler truth. Germany misunderstood its enemy. It mistook confidence for weakness, abundance for fragility, and youth for incompetence. It believed power came only from discipline imposed from above, not from systems that empowered millions to contribute, adapt, and improve. America had not won because it was perfect. It won because it learned faster than Germany could destroy. Every assumption Germany made about American limits became a mirror reflecting its own. Rigidity broke where flexibility endured. Pride collapsed where adaptation thrived. And so the story ended not with triumphal speeches, but with quiet acknowledgement. The laughter from those early days became a warning whispered through history. Underestimating an enemy is not merely a mistake of intelligence, it is a failure of imagination. Germany had failed to imagine what America could become once fully awakened. By the time the world stood still in the ruins of 1945, the lesson was written in steel, smoke, and silence. Wars are not decided by who looks strongest at the beginning, but by who can grow stronger while the war is being fought. Germany never learned that lesson in time. America did.